You are listening to Blue Please right here on CynicalBrit.com with myself, Total Biscuit. This is the reschedule. Oh, we've done pretty well. We've still got like 1,600 listeners on a rescheduled show. Bearing in mind we turned off the front page player, which means that people actually had to do some work in order to listen. That's fairly impressive for a live show. It's actually almost the live show, just normal, everyday Blue Please listener record. So, yeah. Not too bad at all. Okay. So what else am I going to talk about? I have a few things that I do need to discuss. The concept of being a good player, folks. Interesting. It is an interesting concept, isn't it? Something that a lot of people don't really seem to understand and have some very odd ideas about. Anyway. There's this one nice little phrase of the absurd amount of things that I've said over the past few months that has stuck out as actually being reasonable, as opposed to the rest of it, which is just mostly bollocks. And the question is, and the statement is quite simply, I don't want the game nerfed down to my level. I want to raise my level to that of the game. And I keep misquoting myself, incidentally, but it kind of rings true. That's the essence of a good player right there, but there's a lot more to it than that. So let's talk about it. But before we do that, let's talk about what the internet believes is a good player. So, as I've noticed on YouTube, there is, according to the internet, absolutely no middle ground between the most amazing player ever and terrible. There is no middle ground. There are only two types of player. We're talking about the hardest of the hardcore, the elite of the elite, the person that never makes any mistakes ever, and terrible. Interesting, isn't it? Apparently that is the way that it is, according to certain people on YouTube. Like, for instance, I saw my mage guys, there have been some absolutely hilarious things. There was a thread on a certain forum about this that I laughed my arse off at, and a wide variety of different things were said, including a guy who claimed to be a self-confessed expert, had 3,500 posts, was well-respected, and then ended up saying that I was a bad player because, and then stated a fact that was absolutely wrong. So, hey, there you go. Apparently people are real smart, or smirt, as they would probably spell it. Yeah, I like those threads, because generally speaking, they'll say I'm a terrible player. So, like I said, there's no difference between the most amazing player ever and a terrible player. If you've ever been in a pug, and then you look at how I play, you can blatantly see that I am not as bad as them. But since there are only two kinds of player, and I'm not the perfect player, I therefore must be a terrible player. In internet logic. If you can even call it that. If you were interested in what the fact was that he got wrong, by the way, and this was the one thing that he called me out on, and ended up being laughed at as a direct result of that, is that he claimed that Improved Flame Strike was a terrible talent and nobody should take it, and you're an idiot if you take it because of the cost of it. And, of course, he ignored the fact that Blast Wave, he actually went on to say that Blast Wave, when you cast Blast Wave, wasted a ton of mana. Whereas, actually, in fact, when you cast Blast Wave, you get a free Flame Strike out of it, and it's only about 1,500 mana, which makes it the most mana-efficient AoE in the entire game. So, yeah, real mage expert there. Real mage expert. And the rest of them, when asked to actually point out what I said wrong, couldn't. It was, oh, he's terrible. Oh. I saw him backpedaling once. He's the worst player ever. Tell me you've never backpedaled. Everybody backpedals every now and again. And you know what? It doesn't matter, because unless the backpedaling gets you killed, it's irrelevant. It's not the best habit to be in, but then again, it's also not the worst either. Pretty crazy when you think about it. Yeah, that thread and certain posts on the YouTube pages indicated that, oh god, these mage guides are terrible. And the funny thing is, they can never identify why. So either I'm a master of deception, or I somehow managed to come up with these guides which are actually right, just you're going to claim that they're wrong. Okay. Huh. There's a lot of people that don't understand the meaning of the word guide, or testing, for instance. Like, I've actually got someone in the IRC channel who's spurging out right now about the fact that early frost is bad. Well, not really, because like I explained before, what else are you going to put it in? For an optimal single-target DPS, you would be taking early frost, because there is no other way to get down to 31 points. But of course, people don't care, do they? That's not how people think, if they think at all. They want an excuse to spurge out over nothing. I think the concept of the good player, now in the era of having the internet and having everybody involved with the internet, playing multiplayer games and things like that, they all feel like they've got to be the very best. And oddly enough, they generally aren't. But some people fixate on one particular game because they have these delusions of grandeur that they're going to be absolutely unfricking believable in every possible respect. They're going to be a pro gamer. Mom, I don't want to go to college. I want to play Halo. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry. And those of us that play a lot of games, for instance, are generally not amazing at all of them because, generally speaking, practice makes perfect. If you spend 8 hours a day playing one game, the chances are you're probably going to be better at that game than someone that plays 8 games for 1 hour per day. That said, I'm fairly sure that the person that plays 8 games for 1 hour per day is probably better than you at the games that you do not play. As simple as that. But the internet has these unreasonable demands. I've seen this in StarCraft videos. I've seen this in... Actually, come think of it, yeah, any gameplay video ever. By anybody. Even people... The best thing, you've got this kind of policy in Axel and Pixel. You suck at point and clicks. And it's not even ironic or anything. It's actually serious. Oh my god, how could you not know this? Oh, like, Jesus. Wow. People, calm the hell down. Chill out on a frickin' beanbag. And you know what? They don't. Because they have this view that everyone should play every game absolutely perfectly, and if they don't, then they're terrible. No, that's not what being a good player is. What being a good player is learning from your mistakes and not repeating them. It means getting progressively better over the course of time. It means learning a fight, for instance, and getting better until you beat it. Here's the thing, William. There are 3 types of player who are playing Demon Souls right now. One of these players has beaten the first boss, and beat the first boss on his first attempt. Now, of course, the first boss isn't that hard per se, but hey, a little bit tricky. The second player wipes on the first boss 10 times, and then beats the first boss. And the third player doesn't beat him at all. Which of those players is terrible? The answer is none of them. Why? Because that is not a good indicator of whether or not you are a terrible player. If you are a terrible player, the fourth type would be the terrible player. The terrible player is the guy that goes to the first boss and dies the same way 30 times, and then goes onto the internet to complain about the game being terrible. Goes out of his way, in fact, to say to various people, don't get this game is terrible. That's a terrible player. The kind of person that complains and blames the game for their own failings. Now, sometimes there are entirely legitimate circumstances for this. Like, we're talking about random number generator fights that have bugs, fights that are... a prime example, actually, which I will show you in the heroic Lost City of Tolbir bit, is the fact that the final boss has these pillars, which are about 3 inches high, and yet entirely block line of sight. Which is a nightmare. Absolute nightmare, because you don't see them, and you don't realise you're getting LOS'd until you're actually there. Suddenly the healer gets LOS'd, and your tank dies, and everything's going to hell, and you think, oh god, this is horrendous. That doesn't make you a terrible player, that makes the fight terrible. But most of the time, when you're dealing with fights that other people are entirely capable of doing, then you have to consider what exactly they're doing right that you're doing wrong. As I'm thinking you're doing a lot of things wrong, an awful lot of things wrong. A terrible player is not the person that wipes all the time, as long as he eventually learns how not to wipe, and is willing to learn that. It doesn't make him the best player, and it makes him a significantly worse player than the guy who never wipes. It makes him a worse player than the guy who only occasionally wipes. But it doesn't make him a terrible player. That's just how it is. That's the reality of the situation that's been distorted by the internet, who believes that perfection, nothing less than perfection is required. Which is funny, really, because those are generally the kind of people that actually complain on the forums. I would imagine that the same kind of people that complain, oh, you're terrible, blah, 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 are the same kind of people that have complained on the forums begging for nerfs. In fact, I know they are, because I see the correlation. I see some people that post on my instance thread saying, oh, how dare you say this is going to be better, oh, this is going to be harder, oh, I pay my subscription fee, I demand free epics, blah, blah, blah. And then you then see them complaining that I'm not absolutely perfect. Like, okay, interesting, because that seems to me that you are a terrible player, and yet you're claiming it's sort of projection, I suppose, isn't it? placing this label on somebody else other than yourself. Now, let's say that I had somebody in my guild, and I would like people in my guild to not suck. But, of course, my guild's going to be really large, so there are going to be people that are not that great. So, what's going to end up happening is that I would hope these players will get involved in a community where they can improve and they can get better. And you would never say that these people are terrible. Because if they're improving, then they're not terrible. Then you can't be terrible if you're improving. If you're getting better at a steady rate, if you're actually listening and learning from your mistakes, you are not, by any reasonable quantification or definition or rationale, a terrible or bad player. That's what I would like to see the WoW community do. Assuming the WoW community even existed, which it does not. So let's just replace the community with player base. I want to see the player base rise to any occasion. Just some occasion. Other than, say, bloody Brewfest. And you see there's whining about that as well. Oh, it's too hard. Oh, for God's sake. Please. It's enough to give someone a splitting migraine. The basic fact of the matter is that games expect you to get better. And sometimes they will give you a boost. There are some games that will actually say, do you want to go on an easier difficulty? There are some games that will automatically adapt and make the game easier, which is awful, I might add, in a terrible system that should never happen. The whole point is that you play it. The more you play it, the more practice you get, the better you get. So you don't have to worry about going down an easier difficulty level. If you want to, then cool. Just don't expect the same rewards as somebody who's doing the harder difficulty level. And don't ask for the game itself to be nerfed. Oh, this game's too hard. Now, this doesn't happen with single-player games. Hell, most of the time, it doesn't even happen with normal multiplayer games. It happens with massively multiplayer games. Why? Because people feel entitled, because they pay a monthly subscription. That's what makes them believe that they are entitled to have the game tailored exactly to their liking. Usually, exactly to their liking means make this easier so I can get shiny items. No. That is not how things are supposed to work. Ever. Are you afraid that you are a bad player? Are you afraid that you are a terrible player? Well, just analyze your behavior. Do you keep making the same error and then just excusing yourself? Now, I think that's probably one of the best indicators. Do you make excuses for your behavior? Do you constantly try and blame other people? Reminds me of a game of League of Legends I was in today, and I was in the solo ranked queue, which is an incredibly stupid thing to do, I might add. Solo ranked is horrible. But I was doing it anyway, because I just fancied a game before the show, so I jumped in there. And we absolutely ruffle-stomped the other team. It wasn't even funny. It was 30 kills to 5. We killed the Nexus on the 21st minute, I believe, so yeah, it was pretty brutal. And nothing but whining and whining and whining from a player on the other team, like crying, like, oh, this team sucks, it's a noob team. But this guy was like 0 for 7. You can't blame your team for all of your own failings. Sure, bad team is a really bad thing in a team-based game like Dota, Horn, League of Legends, WoW PvP, WoW Raiding, Bloodline Champions, Team Fortress 2, anything that's team-based. A bad team can really, really drag you down. But you've also got to take some responsibility for that bad team, because you were not the guy carrying the team. In fact, you were doing as bad, if not worse, than most of the team members. You can't then go and blame your team for all of that. The likelihood of that actually being the case is astronomical. Sure, in a game like Dota, in a game like Heroes of New Earth or League of Legends, if your team doesn't give a missed call, or if your team doesn't team fight properly, doesn't come when you ask them, etc., etc., and isn't in the right place at the right time, overextends and gets itself killed, gets greedy, does a lot of stupid stuff, builds bad items. Yeah, all of these things are things you can blame the team for, but the team also consists of you. So you can't just blame the team for everything. And I think that is what really justifies a terrible player. A terrible player is the guy that makes the same mistake over and over again and looks for any excuse, anything other than blaming himself and saying, oh, you know what? I just sucked at that. Let's fix it. Let's get better. That's the kind of person that is a terrible player. A person that is incapable of doing that. Critically analysing their own failures and using their knowledge and learning from other people and actually willing to listen to advice. And the problem is there are so many people like that. And indeed, it's one of the reasons why I think that statement from Ghostcrawler earlier, which I will link in the show notes for you, is so valid. Like saying, oh, well, you know, or mock these players if that's how you roll. Yeah, mock them, because you know what? They're not going to listen to anything else. Humiliation is often the only way to get a message into these people's skulls, because they believe that they cannot be at fault. They're absolutely flawless, perfect in every respect. And anything that goes wrong must be someone else's fault or the game's fault. Bad, isn't it? It's pretty goddamn horrendous. But sadly, it's how people are. Mock them. Seriously. Make them feel bad. Maybe it's the only way they'll listen. My name is Total Biscuit. You're listening to Blue Please here on CynicalBrit.com. When I come back after the break, I will answer a brief question because it's not really worth filling an entire segment with. And then I'll do Cataclysm Q&A. This, Devon Townsend, ladies and gentlemen. It's called Bad Devil. Enjoy.